The Holy Bible is practically an owner's manual for slaveholders.
What you're saying is that you can, if you look through the Bible, pick a verse. You can probably find a verse that you can read as abolishing slavery, and then you've got another verse that says you should keep slaves. So you're picking and choosing.
You know, it is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible. It's explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New. There's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery.
Do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes. Well, hello everyone. As those opening clips suggest, there seems to be a growing number of social commentators today who have been attacking the Bible over what it says about slavery. People like Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Alex O'Connor, even Ben Shapiro seem to think that the Bible is morally compromised in regards to slavery because rather than condemn slavery outright, the Bible seems to condone it. So what I want to do in this video is look at all the significant passages to do with slavery in both the Old Testament and the New Testament and see if they actually are as morally reprehensible as these social commentators are making them out to be. Now, when engaging in historical scholarship, we need to be careful we're not imposing modern views or modern culture on these ancient documents. Yet there's a tendency among some to read the transatlantic slave trade of the 16 to 1800s back into the Old Testament legal codes that were written some 3,000 years before into a completely different cultural setting. Now, I understand the rationale behind this. Okay, Western culture has thankfully realized that owning or trading people as chattel is morally wrong. And yet, the Emancipation Proclamation hasn't fixed everything.
The American Civil Rights Movement that totally worked and now everything's fine.
There are still significant issues today for people of colour in the West, some of which can be attributed to generational trauma from slavery or generations of people of colour not enjoying the same opportunities as white people in the West. But in our zeal to deal with the lingering guilt over this, reading the transatlantic slave trade back into the Bible is at best bad scholarship. It's anachronistic. It's like that car that popped up in the movie Braveheart. At worst, it is a bad faith attack, perhaps stemming from having an axe to grind. Now, given I cannot imagine people like Richard Dawkins or Bill Maher or Alex O'Connor having any axe to grind with Christianity, I'm going to assume from here on in that these attacks on the Bible stem from a misunderstanding of the biblical texts, a scholarship issue. So my goal in this video is to show that when we read the biblical texts in their historical and cultural context, we get an entirely different story to what these social commentators are trying to tell. Now, in order to understand the historical and cultural context of ancient Israel, there are two important facts we need to recognize about biblical times. And the first is that ancient Israel was an agrarian society, a subsistence farming society.
You see that? It's made of chicken. It's actually made of chicken. You kill it, you got free chicken. You can sell it to people.
What that meant was, men and women couldn't just go and get a job as a secretary or a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse. Their only hope to live happy and successful lives back then was to get married and have a bunch of kids. Okay, so the sons would help in your fields while your daughters would help around the home. Now, given there was no grocery store or takeout back then, if you wanted to eat, your meals were literally from field to fork. And so the more daughters you had, the more help you had preparing those meals, and the more sons meant more help in the fields, more crops, and more protection against bandits. And so while it might sound a little backwards to modern ears, the way you cared for the well-being of men and women back then was not to get them an education like we do in the West, it was to help them get married. The second important fact is that ancient Israel had no central government.
We must, in my view, always have the right to promote the best man for the job, regardless of sex.
There was no elected officials or government cabinet, no taxation or public works, no standing army or police force, no court system or jail system, and no Department of Public Housing or Welfare. For the first few centuries of its existence, Israel was a decentralized collection of families, clans, and tribes. And so the question we need to ask is, when looking at the Old Testament, what kind of laws would an agrarian society with no centralized government need in order to be a just, fair, and equitable society? Well, as we dive in, it's important to note that the treatment of servants or slaves in ancient Israel was radically different to the antebellum or pre-war American South. And it was also radically different to other cultures of the time and how they treated slaves. And then we see this in a curious little episode from Genesis 16, where Sarai talks her husband Abram into taking a second wife in order to bear an heir. So Sarai, we're told, was unable to bear children, and so she came up with this very sad and ultimately very destructive plan. We read this in Genesis 16 verse 3. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. Now, the topic of polygamy is a whole nother kettle of fish. All I'll say for now is that every single polygamist in the Bible, without exception, suffers serious, if not catastrophic, issues with their marriages or their kids. The Bible is dead against polygamy. But the reason I mention this episode is to point out that Abram doesn't sleep with Hagar until after he marries her. Right? While some ancient cultures treated female slaves as little more than sex slaves, not so in ancient Israel. Servants and slaves were treated with absolute dignity and respect. Well, this brings us to the Old Testament law codes, beginning with Exodus 21, verse 2, which says this: If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. So, straight after the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, the very first thing that God mentions in his law is the fair and just treatment of slaves. And what this shows is God's laws are from the outset all about protecting the vulnerable. But the question we need to ask is, why would you buy a Hebrew servant? Well, there are two other passages that shed light on this, those being Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15. Let me read to you Leviticus 25 verse 39. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. So what do you do in an agrarian society where there's no centralized government and therefore no welfare system if someone falls on hard times? Like, imagine a family suffers several years of failed crops and they borrowed money hoping the next year would be better, but that crop fails too. So they have to sell their family farm, and now they've got no land, no food, and a bank loan to pay off. What do you do? Well, God wrote into his law a system of welfare known as indentured servitude. The way it worked is this: you would ask a rich landowner to take on your financial obligations, such as paying off your debts and offering you shelter and food. And in exchange, you would work for this rich benefactor for a maximum of 6 years, or until you or a close relative, known as a kinsman redeemer, could pay your debt off. And so the word slave in these passages is actually a misnomer. Sadly, we don't have a different word in the Hebrew, but it's more like a business deal. But why then does the language being used sound like slavery to modern ears? Like Leviticus 25:39 says, the slave sells themselves to this rich benefactor, while Exodus 21 verse 2 says if you buy a Hebrew slave. Exodus 21:21 talks about slaves as property. Well, these words have a wide semantic range in the Bible, and they're used elsewhere to talk about free people as well. So, for example, when Eve gives birth to Cain in Genesis 4, she says, "I have brought forth a man-child." But the word translated "brought forth" is the exact same word used in Exodus 21 verse 2 for buying a slave. And then when Boaz marries Ruth, in Ruth chapter 4, he says, "I have acquired a wife." But the word acquired is the exact same word used in Exodus 21:2 for buying a slave. And so given these examples have nothing to do with buying or selling people as chattel, we need to question whether it means that in Leviticus 25 or Exodus 21 as well. And when we take a step back, we realize that these words that have a wide semantic range are being used as figures of speech used to describe an indentured servitude business deal. It's like when we say that a professional sports person gets traded to a different team these days. Being traded doesn't mean that person is being used as chattel, all right? Like, we use that word to talk about trading cards or buying and selling goods, don't we? And so when the Bible uses the word buy or sell or property in regards to indentured servitude, we need to understand we need to ensure we're not reading the transatlantic slave trade back into these texts. All right? These are biblical figures of speech used to describe indentured servitude. So, how exactly does indentured servitude play out? Well, number one, it was to be a last resort. There were several steps that one was to take before entering indentured servitude. So they could glean leftover grain from their fellow Israelites, Leviticus 19 verses 9 and 10. They were to seek charity, which God commanded was to be given generously, Leviticus 25:35. They could borrow money, which God commanded was to be lent at 0 interest, Leviticus 25:36. They were to sell their family land, Leviticus 25:25, or they were to seek help from family members, the aforementioned kinsman redeemer who could redeem them, Leviticus 25:48. Only after exhausting all these measures and options would a person sell themselves into indentured servitude. Second thing we need to understand is it was for a maximum of 6 years. In the 7th year, they were to go free. And according to Deuteronomy 15 verses 13 and 14, they were to be sent off with ample supplies. This leads us to goal number 3. The goal of this process was to get the servant back on their feet financially. Right? The point of that Deuteronomy 15 passage is to fight poverty in Israel. And then number 4, because the rich benefactor was taking on a considerable financial risk in buying a Hebrew indentured servant, the status of indentured servants was deliberately lowered in Israelite society. Right? There were certain privileges that free people had that indentured servants didn't. And so when Exodus 21:21 says the servant is property, it's not referring to them as chattel. It's saying they still have an outstanding debt that needs to be dealt with, needs to take precedence over certain other privileges that free people might have. And in the end, that system is designed to encourage people to pay their debts off as soon as possible to join free society again. So the so-called slavery laws from Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, and Deuteronomy 15 are instead an ancient form of a social safety net. They are voluntary agreements used as a last resort to help those who have fallen on troubled times. And so these indentured servant laws are actually the exact opposite of morally reprehensible. For a society to be just and equitable, it needs a social safety net for the poor. While indentured servitude may seem a little unjust and a little weird to a highly developed society such as the modern West, like America, Britain, or Australia, it was a perfectly tailored system for an agrarian society with no centralised government. However, there are three main criticisms of this welfare system, all seen in Exodus 21. The first is in Exodus 21 verses 3 and 4. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. Now, on the surface, this seems a little harsh, but if we dig just a little deeper, it makes perfect sense, right? If the man came with a wife, then they've both sold themselves into indentured servitude at the same time. And so at the end of 6 years, of course they both go free. Verse 2 demands it. But what if he comes alone and the master gives him a wife? Well, where does this wife come from? Given she belongs to the master, verse 4, she is another of his indentured servants, paying off her debt through 6 years of service. Now imagine the wife still has 3 or 4 years left of service to go when the husband's 6 years are up. What do? Do you just let the wife go even though she's got several years of debt left to pay off? Well, if that is what the law commanded, then no benefactor would ever give a female slave to a male slave as his wife. It would be akin to burning money. Given marriage is how you thrive in an agrarian society, God is not going to legislate any laws that discourage people being given in marriage. Instead, you let the man go to get himself back on his feet while the woman stays to pay her debt off to the master. And at the end of her 6 years of work, she's automatically set free. Verse 2. Now, some might say, but verse 2 is talking about male slaves.
False.
This is an example of case law, which even though it uses male language, it applies just as equally to females. So the wife will be set free after 6 years with her kids, or the husband can save up and pay off her debt early. So again, we should not read the 17th to 19th century transatlantic slave trade into this passage. Yes, families were very cruelly split up in the antebellum American South. But that's not what's going on here. Indentured servitude is a social safety net to allow men and women to get back on their feet by paying off their debts. If rich benefactors were commanded to just let their indentured servants go free early, the whole system would collapse because the rich wouldn't want to risk it. Second criticism is in Exodus 21 verses 5 and 6. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and I don't want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. Now again, it's tempting to read African American slavery back into this, in which the African American slaves had no say in being slaves for life. But again, that's not what's going on here. You were forbidden by the Old Testament law under pains of death from forcing someone into slavery. Exodus 21:16 says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. And Deuteronomy 24 verse 7 says the same thing. These two verses condemn the entire transatlantic slave trade. If only more Christians in the 17th to 19th centuries had listened to those verses, the transatlantic slave trade would have been abolished decades earlier. No, this servant is choosing to remain with his master. But what that means is he's choosing to stay on welfare for life, right? He doesn't want to stand on his own 2 feet. He doesn't want to save up for a home ready for his wife when his wife and kids are released. And he doesn't want to save up so he can release his family early. He's choosing to remain on welfare for life. And this is why he gets his ear pierced. It's a sign of shame designed to discourage people from choosing that path. The third criticism is seen in Exodus 21, verses 7 to 11. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she's not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he's broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Now, the reason female servants were not to go free like the male servants were was for their protection. Remember, the main way you cared for men and women back then was to help them get married. A single woman had no husband to provide for or protect her. This scenario is about a man who has to sell his daughter into indentured servitude, but you don't do that lightly, right? You will try and choose a rich benefactor who will either marry your daughter himself. That's what verse 8 means, choose her for himself, or give her to his son in marriage. That's verse 9. Right? The purpose of this law is to ensure the girl is cared for if the owner or his son changes their mind. That's what breaking faith means in verse 8. The father had an agreement with this master to marry his daughter when she came of age. If that master changes his mind, he's breaking that agreement, breaking faith. Now, verse 10 is tricky because we actually have no idea what that final provision is. It's the only time this word is used in the whole Bible. And most translators have gone with marital rights, which refers to sex. But a second option scholars propose is personal hygiene products such as oils or soaps. And so verse 10 could mean if the son marries a second wife, he must still care for his first wife, the former slave girl. But it could just as easily read if he chooses not to marry the second girl and instead marries another girl, this first girl, who's still a servant, must be shown care, such as food, clothing, and personal hygiene. Otherwise, she's to be set free. And the reason she's to be set free is because God does not tolerate abuse, even of slaves. We see this in Exodus 21, verses 20 to 21. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property, i.e., they still have a debt to pay off. Now, the word punished there literally means avenged. If the slave owner kills one of their slaves, the slave owner is to be put to death. If the slave does not die immediately, then there's no vengeance, there's no death penalty. In that case, a different law is enacted. Exodus 21, verse 26 and 27 says this: An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. Now, some people will read these two passages that are just 4 verses apart and conclude that slave owners were allowed to beat their slaves so long as they didn't kill them or do serious injury to them. But again, that's not how case law works. Right? Case law says if this bad thing happens, then this is to be the response. So, for example, Exodus 22 verse 1 says, whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. This case law is not condoning stealing. It's saying if someone does steal, which is bad, then this is to happen. In the same way, if a slave owner beats his slave, which is bad, then this is to happen. The point of these case laws on slavery are not to say only beat your slave a little. They're to say don't beat your slave at all. And if you do, you might lose your life or money. Right? These passages are not oppressive to women or slaves. They are trying to protect the rights of women and slaves. It's the same with Leviticus 19 verse 20. It says this: if a man sleeps with a female slave who is promised to another man, who has not yet been ransomed or given her freedom, there must be due punishment. Yet they are not to be put to death because she has not been freed. The reason the punishment for sleeping with a slave girl is different to the punishment for sleeping with a free woman, see Deuteronomy 22 verses 23 to 29, is because there is a significant debt involved with an indentured servant. But the whole point of Leviticus 19:20 is to protect the vulnerable. Right? If a man rapes or coerces a servant girl into sex, there must be due punishment. So Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25 are not a treatise on slavery, as some ignorantly claim. It is God setting up a social welfare system for those who fall on hard times, ensuring they will be treated with utmost dignity and respect while they get back on their feet. And so if we're railing against the Bible's view on slavery, we are in part railing against the Bible's welfare system that they set up for this ancient, decentralized agrarian society. But that's not the only form of slavery in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 20 verses 10 to 12 says this: when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. Now, the morality of God commanding the Israelites to wipe out the entire people of Canaan is for another video, right? This one's long enough without opening that can of worms. But what I can say is the conquest of Canaan is in part God judging the people of Canaan for their sin. Genesis 15 verse 16 says this: in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. For those who like to say, why doesn't God end all the evil? He actually has, on several occasions. The conquest of Canaan was God judging an entire nation of Nazi-like monsters, of ISIS-like terrorists. But again, that's for a different video. The question this passage raises is, how do you bring an entire nation of wicked people to justice if you have no prison system? I mean, think about it. Imagine you are stranded on a desert island before satellites with 5 men and 5 women. Yet early on, one of the men starts to sexually assault all the women. And when another man steps in to stop him, the rapist then murders that man. What do you do? How do you stop this violent criminal from continuing on in his violence if you have no prison system? Well, you can either give him a stern talking to, or tie him up and post a guard 24/7 between the rest of you, or impose capital punishments on that rapist/murderer. In the same way, how do you punish the Canaanites for their crimes against humanity if you have no prison system? Well, you either put them all to death, or you find an alternate incarceration system. And that's what this forced labour was. It is to stop their violent enemies from banding together and rising up against them. So they forced them into labour. It's not too dissimilar to the US prison system. Right? Those found guilty of crimes against society are put on chain gangs or made to produce number plates. In the same way, the system for captured enemies in this ancient society was to split them up, send them off to different households as slaves so they can repay their debt to society and not band together and violently rise up against isolated Israelite communities. So just like indentured servitude was actually a moral system of welfare, imposing forced labour on captured enemies was a moral system of justice. It punished the wicked for their violent crimes. It protected society from those violent criminals banding together when there was no prison system. without having to put them all to death. The third and final form of slavery in the Old Testament is seen in Leviticus 25 verses 44 to 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Now, on the surface, this passage seems to be suggesting that Israelites could trade in foreigners as chattel. But again, we need to be careful we're not reading modern black slavery into this ancient culture. So to begin with, we've already seen how phrases like buying, selling, property, and here bequeathing are figures of speech akin to trading a professional sports person for the ancient indentured servitude system. Right? These ancient slaves are no more chattel as the modern sports person is. It's just one of the Old Testament language used for dealing with indentured servitude. Second, the Old Testament law demands foreigners be treated well. Leviticus 19 verses 33 and 34 said, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt." So how do we square Leviticus 19 with Leviticus 25? How does Israel treat foreigners the same as native-born Israelites, but still be able to trade them as chattel? Well, either the author has decided to directly contradict himself within 6 chapters, or Leviticus 25 is not talking about trading foreign slaves as chattel. Exhibit B for this would be Deuteronomy 23 verses 15 to 16, which says, "If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them." Now, given Israelites were only to live in their ancestral land, this runaway slave is most likely a foreigner because he's allowed to live wherever he wants. And this is yet another Bible verse that flies in the face of the antebellum American South, where runaway slaves were required by law to be returned to their masters, even though those masters were evilly oppressing them. Not so in ancient Israel. So what do we make of this standalone passage in Leviticus 25 talking about foreign slaves? Do we read the transatlantic slave trade back into it, concluding that foreigners were allowed to be traded as chattel? Or do we look a little closer at the context of Leviticus 25? Because from verse 8 to the end, it is all about controlling debt so that successive generations are not crushed under the debt of their ancestors. And when we realize this, these verses about foreign slaves take on a whole new meaning. In his book, Is God a Moral Monster?, Paul Copan points out that foreigners were not allowed to purchase land in Israel. So what do foreigners do if they want to live in Israel, because Israel is a fair and just system, but they don't want to get circumcised or give up bacon? How does a foreigner thrive in Israelite society if they can't own land? Well, the answer was to attach yourself to a rich benefactor and become a type of indentured servant. Again, there is zero indication in this passage that this is a forced arrangement. The only reason we might think these people are forced into servitude is because we're reading black slavery back into it. Okay? Foreign slaves were not able to be forced into slavery, because Deuteronomy 23 verses 15 to 16 said runaway slaves are allowed to seek refuge anywhere in Israel. There is nothing in all the Old Testament that suggests lifelong forced slavery. The so-called foreign slaves in this passage are voluntary, right? And they are voluntarily selling themselves into indentured servitude so that they can become an integral part of Israelite life. And this is why they could be bequeathed in a person's will. Right? Just because the head of the house dies doesn't mean these foreign indentured servants become outcasts. They are to remain a part of the household they have chosen to live in. Okay? Leviticus 25 verses 44 to 46 is about buying foreign indentured servants to help them thrive, just like you do Israelite indentured servants. Well, before we leave the Old Testament, there is one more passage on slavery that's worth a mention. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1 says this: "The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves.' And Elisha helps her." Now, some may claim this is another case of the Bible condoning slavery. But there's a big difference between mentioning something and condoning it. The man who was coming to take these 2 boys by force was breaking the Old Testament law. You cannot force anyone into slavery in ancient Israel unless it was a violent enemy who chose ancient Israel's form of incarceration over death. Well, that's the main Old Testament passages on slavery. If I've missed any, please just mention them down in the comments and I'll see if I can answer those as well. But the upshot is, the Old Testament slavery system had nothing in common with other ancient slavery systems, such as the Hammurabi Code. And it had nothing in common with the transatlantic slave system. The slavery system set up in the Old Testament law was either a social safety net designed to help poor Israelites get back on their feet, a form of justice for foreign enemies that acted as an alternative to capital punishment, and a form of social justice that allowed foreigners to become fully functioning members of Israelite society. So to claim the Old Testament slavery system is morally reprehensible because it sounds too much like the transatlantic slave trade is at best anachronistic. It's out of place. At worst, it is a bad faith treatment of this ancient document. The Old Testament law does not condone trading people as chattel. It condemns forcing people into lifelong slavery. Rather, the Old Testament slavery system is morally blameless, as it is condoning the caring for the poor, the marginalised, and the oppressed. Well, before we jump in the New Testament, can I quickly say that if you're finding this video helpful or beneficial, please hit like and subscribe so that the algorithm can get it out for more people. Thanks. But this brings us to the New Testament, which according to the timer below, should not take as long. And the thing we need to understand about slavery in the New Testament is that it is not like the indentured servitude or the punishment for enemies in the Old Testament. All right, slavery in the New Testament in the Roman Empire is chattel slavery. And there are 3 main issues with regards to how the New Testament handles this chattel slavery. And they are, why doesn't the New Testament condemn slavery? Why does the New Testament treat slaves as slaves? And what the New Testament says to actually abolish slavery. So to begin with, one of the criticisms thrown at the New Testament is, why couldn't we get just one verse that says slavery must be abolished? Like if the Christian scriptures contain one verse that demanded slavery be outlawed, wouldn't Christians have succeeded in abolishing the slave trade centuries earlier? Well, it's a good question on the surface. But if we dig just a little deeper, we realise it's actually a stupid question. And the reason is, what would have happened if the New Testament did contain a verse calling for the abolition of slavery? To begin with, the early Christians would have had to obey that verse and call on the Roman Empire to abolish slavery. Yet slavery was an entrenched part of the Roman Empire. It's estimated that like 20 to 30% of the population were slaves. So how do you think the Roman Empire would have reacted to this tiny new little sect that was threatening the economic stability of the entire empire? Christians were already being thrown to the lions for doing nothing more than paying their taxes, helping the poor, treating the sick, and treating women, children, and slaves better than other religions. In his book, Is God a Moral Monster?, Copen says a slave uprising would do the gospel a disservice and prove a direct threat to an oppressive Roman establishment. It would do the gospel a disservice because a slave uprising would distract from the most important role of Christianity, which is to make disciples of all nations, Matthew 28, 19 and 20. And it would give Christianity a reputation as more of a revolutionary movement than a religion of love and charity. But furthermore, the Romans would have dealt with the threat of this tiny little sect the same way they dealt with any threat, through crushing them militarily. The reason the New Testament doesn't contain a verse calling for slavery to be abolished is because the New Testament is not stupid. It understands human nature and understands that true change requires a nuanced approach, not through a verse calling for Christians to arms. Take Abraham Lincoln, for example. Copen writes this: being an exceptional student of human nature, Lincoln recognized that political realities and predictable reactions require an incremental approach. The radical abolitionist route of John Brown and William Lloyd Garrison would, and did, simply create a social backlash against hardcore abolitionists and make emancipation all the more difficult. So the answer to the question, why doesn't the Bible contain one verse calling for slavery to be outlawed, is that it would have ruined the reputation of the Christian church, ruined the chances of the Christian church getting off the ground, and ruined the chances of slavery being outlawed altogether down the track. Because it was evangelical Christians who brought about the abolition of slavery in both England and America. The second issue with the New Testament is that it does speak to slaves in their capacity as slaves. Like, isn't speaking to slaves as slaves and commanding slaves to be good slaves suggesting that the New Testament is pro-slavery?
False.
When the Apostle Paul writes to slaves in passages like Ephesians 6, Colossians 3, and Titus 2, it doesn't mean he's condoning slavery. Like, if someone wrote a letter to Nelson Mandela during his years of incarceration, does that mean he's condoning Nelson Mandela's incarceration? No. The reason Paul specifically addresses slaves in some of his letters is because, contrary to the culture of his time, slaves were treated as equal members of the Christian church. Paul writes this in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ. In speaking to slaves about particular issues for their circumstances, Paul was doing something radical in his culture. He was treating slaves as equals. Well, okay then. I understand speaking to slaves. Why then does Paul speak to slave masters? Well, that's how you change culture. Paul's letter to Philemon is primarily about one of Philemon's slaves named Onesimus, who we believe, we're not certain, but we believe may have run away. We can't prove that though. But in verse 12, Paul says, I'm sending Onesimus back to you. Now, why would Paul do this? Well, to begin with, we have no reason to believe that Onesimus isn't going back willingly. But more importantly, notice how Paul sends him back. He says this to Philemon in verses 15 to 16. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. Speaking as an apostle, Paul is telling Philemon to treat Onesimus as a brother, which is the New Testament code for a fellow Christian. And he says the same thing to slave owners in Ephesus and Colossae, to treat their slaves like they treat their Christian brothers and sisters at church. That is about as radical a break from the cultural norms of the day as you can get. And that is how the New Testament writers brought about incremental change to the slave movement. Right? How do you, as a Christian, treat someone as a Christian brother or sister whilst considering them as chattel? The short answer is you can't. One of those things has to give. By far the most important verse in the Bible, though, for the abolition of slavery is found in 1 Timothy 1, verses 9 and 10. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers. Now, the Bible's view on homosexuality is a contentious issue for modern Western culture, but again, let's save that for another video. The importance of this verse is that Paul is condemning slavery. The Bible does condemn slavery. These two verses list off some of the worst people in society: violent insurrectionists, murderers, those who murder their parents, those who lie and cheat to get ahead, those who lie under oath and pervert justice. These are the worst of the worst. And included among them are slave traders. All right, according to the New Testament, anyone involved in the slave trade movement are to be condemned alongside the worst of sinners in society. And so again, if more Christians paid attention to this verse during the transatlantic slave movement, that movement would have been abolished decades earlier. In the end, it's the teaching of the Old Testament and the New Testament that actually led people like William Wilberforce to give their all in the fight to abolish slavery. Okay? The Old Testament forbade kidnapping of people from slavery. The Old Testament allowed runaway slaves to take refuge in Israel. It forbade indentured servants from being mistreated. Instead, it commanded that those who fell on hard times be helped back on their feet. And then the New Testament turned first century culture upside down. It didn't do it by calling for a slave uprising. It did it by treating slaves as equals, commanding slave masters treat their slaves as Christians, and in the end, condemning the entire slave trade movement. Well, thanks for listening. My hope is that this video will go some way towards correcting some of the misunderstandings out there over what the Bible says about slavery. It is not an owner's manual for slaveholders. And there's no verse that says you keep people as chattel. If we put the work in and read the Bible in its historical and cultural context, we will be able to see that. So I pray you every success in doing that in your journey into seeking the truth.